In the jellyfish caves, there is a funny gate. If you try to race through this gate with a ledge cruise boost, and it is seemingly random whether you make it. The first part of this video will explain the most consistent method I found to pass the funny gate and how to execute it. The second part of this video will explain all the research I have done to find this method. In the third part of this video, I will use the ideas from the research to discuss other methods which are worth considering, because they have certain trade-off properties. The last part of this video will discuss possibilities for future research. So let me start by explaining the most consistent method I found to pass the funny gate. I define jumping towards the funny gate as tapping the jump button and starting to hold forwards at the same time from this location. So this is jumping towards the funny gate. My method of passing the funny gate is to jump towards the funny gate in intervals of exactly 6.2 seconds. In order to execute this method, I wrote a Python program that makes beep sounds to indicate 3, 2, 1, go in intervals of 6.2 seconds. For every go beep, I jump towards the gate. So let me just show you a few examples. So this is the program that makes the beeps. And then on the fourth beep, I jump towards the funny gate. And then at some point you are supposed to make it through the gate. While this works great for my purposes, in an actual run you would not want to waste time waiting to jump towards the funny gate. Therefore, I propose somebody should make a program that reads an input, preferably something that does not require your hands, like a foot pedal, and then exactly when you jump towards the funny gate for the first time, you should send the program the input. The program will then count down when you should jump towards the funny gate again. It will be 2 weeks until I have the time to develop such a program, so hopefully somebody else will be available for that task. In my research, I have concluded that there is no possible method that guarantees you pass the funny gate within 2 attempts. But this method supposedly guarantees that you pass the funny gate within 3 attempts, if you execute it within 0.05 seconds of precision. With frame perfect precision, you should get it first try approximately 46% of the times, second try approximately 33% of the times, and third try the remaining approximately 21% of the times. This means that you lose approximately 4.5 seconds on average compared to a first try funny gate. Now let me explain how I found this method. The very first thing I did was make a save state right before jumping towards the funny gate. Then I repeatedly load the save state, stand still for a few frames, and jump towards the funny gate. So let me show you an example. So now I load the save state and I advance 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames. Now I hold the jump button and the forwards button. I advance 2 more frames. I release the jump button but still hold the forward button, and then I continue the game. Now we see that I did not pass the funny gate. Now we can try this again. So I load the save state. Now let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 frames. And now I hold the jump button and the forwards button. We go 2 more frames, only the forwards button, and ta-da, this time we do go through the gate. So for a little over 300 frames, I tested whether or not you pass through the funny gate. And to my surprise, the results did not look like random noise. Instead, they were alternating intervals of 12 to 17 frames long. So this was the data, and the way you read this is frames 1 through 5 let you through the funny gate, and this interval is 5 frames long. Then frames 6 through 22 did not let me through the funny gate, and this was an interval of 17 frames long. Then frames 23 to 36 did let me through the funny gate, and that's an interval of 14 frames long, etc, etc. Now, as you can see, the successful intervals are usually 14 frames long. Now, the first one is cut off by the save state. However, here we see that not every interval is 14 frames long. This one, for some reason, is 12 frames long, and here we have one that is 15 frames long. And the unsuccessful frame intervals are 17 or 16 frames long. Now, I do not know if all of them are 17 or 16 frames long, but at least these are. And I could not find any obvious pattern in these precise values. So yeah. But this is certainly good news because it implies that knowing which frames are successful makes it easy to hit successful frames. A window of more than 10 frames is easy to hit. Of course, the unsolved part of the puzzle is figuring out which frames are successful. Now, this is a good time to mention that I have absolutely no idea as to why the funny gate behaves the way it does. I also have absolutely no idea as to what even influences whether you pass the funny gate. And for this reason, I assume that the first time you jump towards the funny gate is uniformly random. Note that it is currently believed that the funny gate is independent of random number generation, so the only randomness in my model comes from the moment we decide to jump towards the funny gate the first time. I will say more about this assumption in the last part of the video. So from now on, I define an interval as a time period during which the funny gate either consistently lets you pass or consistently does not let you pass. So from frame 6 through 22 is an interval. It's called an unsuccessful interval because it does not let you pass. Then frames 23 through 36 are also an interval, and this is a successful interval. Now, I define a cycle as 2 consecutive intervals. And then the first consequence of our randomness assumption is that we have no influence on the probability that you pass the funny gate on your first attempt. However, failing to pass the funny gate gives you information about where in the current cycle you are. We can then use that information to increase the probability of passing the funny gate on subsequent attempts. For illustrative purposes, let us assume for a moment that all intervals are 15 frames long. Then jumping towards the funny gate twice with 15 frames apart would guarantee that one of the attempts would let you pass the funny gate. As you can see here, this is an illustration. The green bars are successful intervals and the red parts are the unsuccessful intervals. And these two arrows show where we jump towards the funny gate. And then wherever I put this, at least one of the two arrows points to a green interval, which means that one of the two arrows which will point to a successful frame. So indeed, if you have your two attempts 15 frames apart, one of them will let you pass through the funny gate. And this is the type of method that I have been studying. I have tried to determine the optimal time intervals at which to jump towards the funny gate. Now, apart from the wrong assumption, there is still one major problem with the example I just gave. There is no way to jump towards the funny gate twice with that little time in between. I have timed myself to require approximately 6 seconds in between two jumps towards the funny gate. This can easily be solved by jumping towards the funny gate with 375 frames apart instead of 15. This is also why my first suggested method was to jump towards the funny gate when there is a whole number of seconds on the timer, and then another time a quarter of a second after there is a whole number of seconds on the timer. Now there are three problems with this approach. The first problem is that it requires frame perfect execution to guarantee that you pass the funny gate within 2 attempts. The second problem is that we are still using the wrong assumption that all intervals are 15 frames long. In fact, the successful intervals are on average shorter than the unsuccessful intervals. From this we can conclude that it is impossible to guarantee that you pass the funny gate within 2 attempts, even with frame perfect execution. The third problem also has to do with the wrong assumption, because the average interval is not 15 frames long. It is slightly longer. When you need 6 seconds to jump towards the funny gate a second time, this difference is multiplied by 24 and becomes more than a frame, and thus significant. The first and second problem can be fixed by changing our goal from trying to pass the funny gate within 2 attempts to trying to pass the gate within 3 attempts. For illustrative purposes, let us assume for the moment that all successful intervals are 14 frames long and all unsuccessful intervals are 16 frames long. Then jumping towards the funny gate thrice with 10 frames apart would guarantee that one of the attempts would let you pass the funny gate. Again, as you can see, if I move these 3 arrows, then always at least one of these arrows will point at the green region. Moreover, missing the frame by at most 2 frames still comes with the same guarantee. And as you can see, when I move this around, for example now, there is only one arrow pointing at green. However, there is a pretty large region around the arrow which is green, which means that you do not have to be frame perfect or anywhere near it to actually hit a successful frame. Now it can become quite a bit more narrow. For example, now there are only a few frames where you actually hit a successful full frame, but if it becomes too little, then there is another arrow over here which has a larger interval. So if for each arrow you hit it with at most 2 frames apart, you will be guaranteed to hit a successful frame. Of course, we must still consider that there is no way to jump towards the funny gate thrice with that little time in between, so we would have to make that 370 frames instead of 10. Now the only problem left to solve is that the average cycle is not 30 frames long. For this reason, my next goal was to determine the average cycle length. Since it takes me 6 seconds in between two jumps towards the funny gate, I have tried to determine the average length of 13 cycles. If I were to repeatedly jump towards the funny gate in time intervals of exactly the average length of 13 cycles, then failing to pass the funny gate once should guarantee that I failed every single time after that. So I used the ternary search algorithm to determine the interval at which I would fail to pass the funny gate as many times in a row. I found that repeatedly jumping towards the funny gate in intervals of 6.536 seconds allowed me to finally pass the funny gate only on my 111th attempt. Now this was the worst out of 15 tries, but still, that's That's larger than any other attempt for other intervals. For this reason, I estimate the average cycle to last for 6.536 divided by 13, which is approximately 0.503 seconds. In conclusion, the method we have currently come up with is to wait 12 and a third cycle in between jumps towards the funny gate, and this turns out to be incredibly close to 6.2 seconds. And I have tested this method 100 times, and I managed to pass the funny gate within 3 attempts every single time. Now that you hopefully understand the logic behind my method, we can discuss possible alternative methods. My method was designed to be the easiest possible method that guarantees you pass the funny gate within 3 attempts. Easiest in the sense that the leniency of your timing is maximized. However, what is not maximized is the probability of passing the funny gate on your second attempt rather than a subsequent attempt. The first alternative method worth considering needs more precise timing, but the probability of passing the funny gate on your second attempt rather than your third is maximized. This idea also comes at a risk independent of your skill, because the intervals are not yet completely understood. It could be that a 12 frame long successful interval happens to mess up your cycle. The second alternative method worth considering is to only maximize the probability of passing the funny gate on your second attempt and not focusing on any subsequent attempts. Because after all, a third try funny gate already kind of ruins your pace anyways. We can also combine the goals of the two alternative methods and put our highest priority on maximizing the probability of passing the funny gate on your second attempt, and our second priority on maximizing the probability of passing the funny gate on your third attempt. And finally, worth mentioning is that I personally need 12 cycles in between jumps towards the funny gate, but someone else might be able to do this consistently with only 11 cycles or even less. Thus, multiples of 0.503 seconds can be added or subtracted from the time intervals between attempts at will. Since I find the third alternative method to be a very valid option, let me explain how you can deduce at what time intervals you would want to jump towards the funny gate. We first need 12 cycles to be ready for another jumps towards the funny gate. We add 14 frames because that is the most common length of a successful interval. This gives 6.267 seconds between the first and second attempts. If both attempts fail, then it is more likely that the successful interval is to the right of the second attempt in the cycle compared to the left. There are 16 frames left on the right and 14 frames left on the left. And we aim for the middle, which means we add 8 frames. This gives 6.167 seconds between the second and third attempt. For the fourth attempt, we add 8 more frames to get back to the start of the cycle. And then there are 14 unchecked frames, so we add 7 more frames to get right in the middle. This gives 6.283 seconds between the third and fourth attempts. Finally, let me discuss the possible future research on the topic. The most important research that still needs to be done is testing these methods on other consoles. All my testing has been done on GameCube emulator Dolphin and on the NTSC version. It is very important that these methods also work on Xbox because that is the fastest console. The next most obvious future research is to do more testing to verify the success rates of the proposed methods and to possibly find even better methods. If you have a computer, you can install Dolphin, and with the Dolphin memory engine, you can give yourself a fast enough cruise boost without any required skill. With save states and frame advance, you can do all the testing you want. The final and arguably most important future research is to determine exactly what determines whether the funny gate will let you pass. I personally have no good ideas on how to do research on this, so I will leave that to other people. The only alternative to the current method that is fast in 100% is using a displacement cruise boost, which is arguably much worse than the funny gate. So it is of great interest to improve the consistency of the funny gate. On that note, I end this video.